Hi, welcome to another thrilling episode of Mosquito Bites and Mystery. We are looking at the unknown, deep, hidden history of Florida, some type of spiritual thought that goes along with history that you may not be aware of. Now, the reason we share that is because history is something that we need to know, and history helps make us who we are. It gets us to where we are today. And so history doesn't happen in a vacuum. It really does matter. If we learn from history, we become better and we don't make the same mistakes. If we fail to embrace and learn history, we're destined to make mistakes and miss things that we ought not to miss. So let me set this story up for you. The young man began his study to be a minister. And the study began in Tennessee, but his health was poor. And his doctor recommended that he seek a warmer climate. You can tell where this is going. So he moved to the land of Mosquito Bites and Mystery. Yes, the state of Florida. He found what he was looking for at a tiny Florida Bible Institute just outside of Tampa. To be very honest with you, his preaching, not so good. Most people that heard him thought he was incredibly boring. So he did what anybody trying to learn the craft would do. Now, this is not what preachers do today, but this is what preachers did in the day. And so he began preaching on street corners, and he would preach in mobile home parks. And he would preach for what would be today probably homeowners associations, but they were glorified park gatherings of neighborhoods and communities. He had 4 basic sermons that he had borrowed and adapted and polished and honed to something that he thought was usable. The young man was invited by a friend to join him at a religious conference in Palatka, Florida, which is about 150 miles away near St. Augustine from where he was in Tampa. His friend, the dean of the school, was asked to preach at a small Baptist church, and he said, "No, I have a friend with me. He's going to preach." Later on, this preacher would say that he was stunned at the invitation. I quote what he wrote. "I was so frightened that I spent the night studying and praying instead of sleeping. The congregation of about 40 included ranchers and cowboys in overalls and their women in cotton white dresses. He stood behind the pulpit that first day and his knees shook. And he gave one of his 4 sermons. Again, I quote what he wrote. It seemed to be over almost as soon as I started. So he added his second sermon to the first sermon to make it just a little bit longer. Then he finally added the third sermon to the first and second sermon to get to a workable sermon length. And then, because he still had time to fill, he threw in his final sermon. And so he literally preached all 4 of his sermons and then sat down. All 4 sermons lasted a grand total of 10 minutes. The experience was so horrible that it convinced him that he was never going to be a good preacher, he was never going to be an evangelist, that he needed to find something else to do besides ministry. He was supposed to speak again in Palatka, but he was so depressed that he decided not to return. And yet a friend came alongside him and convinced him to fulfill his obligation. On his second appearance in Palatka, the crowds were larger, and they kept growing. And each day he was there for this particular conference he was leading. Eventually, that small church was filled, it was overflowing. Out of those insignificant stars, out of that insignificant beginning, out of using every sermon he had at this small little church, and finishing up and exhausting his theological knowledge in under 10 minutes, this evangelist would one day find his voice. His name, Billy Graham. And Billy Graham would leave Florida and wouldn't come back until, 1949, 1950. By then, he was nationally known. And when he returned to Miami, he drew 35,000 people on his return tour to Florida. Yet those humble beginnings and those misfires and nervous moments and what some might say were missteps, yet others would see God at work growing and developing something amazing from what was a humble beginning. Take Dr. Billy Graham, perhaps one of the most recognized, if not the most recognized preacher ever to walk the planet and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you go back to the story that I just told you, a weak, sick boy from Tennessee that moves to Florida for the climate. He goes to school, but he can't preach very well. He practices on street corners and in mobile home parks, and his first sermon was really all 4 sermons that he had combined together in less than 10 minutes. In his own mind, he tanked in the big metropolis of Palatka, Florida. And yet, wouldn't you like to be one of those people that would have been there in Palatka during the first Billy Graham sermon and say, I was there when he preached his first sermon? I guarantee you that if you look back on that bad sermon that Dr. Graham would have preached back in that day, and you remember it years later, the fact that you could tell the story about Billy Graham preaching a sermon, you would have people convinced by the time you were done telling the story it was the greatest sermon you ever heard, and you always knew he was destined for greatness. See, that's what history does. The gift of time allows us to find our voice and give meaning to the things that we see. A bad preacher, a small Baptist church, an insignificant meaning, was the launching point for a global ministry that would touch lives then and continue to touch lives today through the Billy Graham Association and his son, Franklin Graham, and the ministry that he has worldwide. Don't frown on humble beginnings. Everybody has to start somewhere. And that includes you and me. History is full of mysterious, nearly unexplainable starts and moments where in that particular instant of time, we have no idea what's going to happen. And yet when God steps into the mix, then anything and everything can happen. So remember that next time that you're doing something and it doesn't seem like it's really big or really important, or you feel like you're not qualified, or you feel like you just can't, or you feel like you're embarrassed. It might be the very place that God has placed you to begin his next great work, not only in you, but in the lives of others. I look forward to joining you next time for Mosquito Bites and Mysteries in the History of Florida.